Talk about ASP.NET Core Web API interview questions with answers. So these are all real-time interview questions. So what is .NET Core Web API? So ASP.NET Core Web API is a framework for building RESTful APIs. What is RESTful API? Which will allow communication between the client and server. So Web API, ASP.NET Core Web API application program interface is a framework for building RESTful APIs that will allow communication between the client and server application. So for example, if you see there is a class controller, products controller, which is derived from controller base. And here we have applied some route. Here we have applied some API controller attribute. And this is HTTP GET attribute. And then public I action result. In some of the interviews, they'll ask question, what is the return type of action method in web API? I mean, return type I action result, you can specify. This is get method return OK. And then list of products we can give. So now, so what is dependency injection, DI? This is very, very important real-time interview questions. Whatever interview you are facing, at least in 10 interviews, 6 to 7 interviewers, they will ask about this question because that much important this is. What is DI? DI stands for dependency injection. Dependency injection. Okay. So this will come from, it is a design pattern. What is dependency injection? Is a design pattern which will come from the inversion of control. IOC, we'll call it as inversion of control. Okay. So what the purpose of dependency injection? For example, I have a interface and I want to create an object for my interface. For example, I dependency will create object for it, and within the constructor, this is constructor, so we will pass an argument, and as a argument like this will pass, and within the constructor will injecting like this. This is how, like this object read only private read only object equals this object. This is how we will inject the injection. Like we will be having 3 different types of injections, like dependencies, lifetimes, like transient, scope, singleton. So what is transient? Each time I have to create a new instance. That particular time will go for a transient. And scope, I want to carry a single instance throughout the request. In this particular scenario, you can go for the scope. So transient, you can to register the services. That is, we can use the transient because that, each time we need a new instance. And scope, example, database connection string, because a single connection required throughout the request. That particular scenario, we can go for a scope. And we have another one, singleton, means a single pattern required throughout our application. This particular scenario will go for the singleton. And for example, I want to implement a logger throughout my application. A single instance is sufficient. So this particular scenario will capture the logs. This particular scenario will go for the singleton. So that are the 3 different types of scopes we have in .NET Core. So now explain the request processing pipeline. So we have middleware. This is again one of the most important interview question. What is middleware? Middleware will process the request and response HTTP request and response pipeline, which will handle the request and response in HTTP pipeline, which is called a middleware. So for example, app.use routing, app.use authentication, authorization, you can use for logging, whatever things you want to implement, we can implement the middleware. For example, to capturing the exceptions, we can use the middleware. So next, what are the filters in ASP.NET Core? Filters are used to run code before and after specific stages in the request processing pipeline. For example, we'll be having action filters, authorization filters. How you create a filter? How you create a custom filter? So for example, I'll create a custom action filter. This should be derived from a I action filter interface. For example, authorization filter also I authorization filter interface. And within the action filter, on action executing, on action executed. So what is this? This is while method is getting executing. Once method will get executed, this event will trigger. So this is action filter, which will execute before and after action get executes. This is again one of the important interview question for both web API as well as MVC. How to enable cards in ASP.NET Core? Recently, one of the interviewer, they asked about this question. Cards, cross origin resource sharing. Cross origin resource sharing is a mechanism that allows restricted resources on a web page to be requested from another domain. For example, you have implemented when these cars got enabled in Web API 2.0 onwards, cars got enabled. What happened? By default, this will restrict the other application, like third-party access, to implement the to prevent the attacks, all those things. Okay. So how you can allow. So what are the sites? What are the clients you want to allow? So here different options will be there. For example, in program.cs, builder.services start, add cars. option start, add policy, allow all. If you want to allow all the sites. So builder origin, allow method like this. You will add cars. Now, how do you secure web APIs? To secure web APIs, you can, for example, JWT token based authentication. So how this JWT token will work? First, you have to create the token. How you will create the token? So there are different ways. Like, for example, I'll tell you one generic way. So we'll be sending while logging, we'll be sending the username and password, right? User ID and password. Based on the user ID, we are going to generate the token. So that token, so then it will send it back to the client. So like that, it will do that handshaking. So we will follow different algorithms to implement this, and OAuth, and there are other mechanisms. So this is how we'll be using the bearer token. And in the HTTP request, along with our header, we will pass this token. So what is routing in ASP.NET Core Web API? The routing is used to define the endpoints the API will respond to. For example, our routing will work API/products. Means there will be a API prefix as after your local host API/products. It will become like this. After that, get attribute ID value it will take. It was here. So based on that ID, we are assigning to the product ID. This is how routing will work. So this is called attribute routing. So by default, we'll call it as the conventional routing, and this is attribute. We are specifying route attribute. That's why we'll call it as attribute routing. So what is model binding? Model binding maps data from HTTP request to action method parameters. For example, we are using a HTTP post request. When you send the HTTP post request, the data will be carried through form body. So here to read that from your HTTP request, we'll use form body. Like that, form route. If you want to read from route parameter, this is called model binding. We'll call it as model binding. So here, product is our model. Product is, this is the object of that particular product, so that we get the entire HTTP body in the post request. Whatever we'll send in the body, it will read and assign to this. So how you do the model validation? Like data annotation, we'll call it as, like once we receive the HTTP request, that should meet the specified rules. For example, in earlier example, we have product. So name is required field. Means without name, if name is empty, then it won't allow because it's a mandatory field. So what are DTOs? DTO used to transfer the data between the layers. Okay. So product DTO, for example, it's a common DTO model. So where we'll be having name and price, which when our application is a multi-layer application, to transfer the data from one layer to another layer, we'll use the DTOs. So explain global exception handling. How you handle the global exceptions. So earlier we have seen, so to handle the exceptions using middleware also we can handle the exceptions. So to handle these global exceptions, we can use middleware to handle the exceptions globally. So in the program.cs, you have to specify app.use exception handler. Like this, we will handle the exceptions. What is versioning in web APIs? So API version, okay. When we'll have a different versions, you have to maintain version history. For example, you will be defining different route with version 1.0, 2.0, 1.1, 2.1, like that. Why versioning is required? This helps us to manage the changes without breaking the existing functionality. For example, version 2, you want to give to another client. So version 1 already using by some other client. So version 1 should not be changed. Why? Because that is, if you change something, it may break the existing functionality. So this is how API versioning is important. What is asynchronous programming? Asynchronous programming to improve the scalability and responsiveness by freeing up resources during long running tasks. For example, in synchronization, what will happen? For example, method 1, method 2, method 3, method 4 is there. In synchronization, what will happen? Synchronous programming, method 1 has to be completed, then it will go to method 2. Method 2 has to be completed, then it will move to the method 3. Method 3 has to be completed, then it move to method 4. In asynchronous programming, what will happen? Method 1, method 2, method 3, method 4, which will execute parallelly. Method 1 will start, method 2 will start, method 3 will start, method 4 will start. And method 4 is await until unless method 4 will read the response. All 4 methods will execute parallelly, and once method 4 result is read, that time it will return the response. This is how asynchronous programming will work. And if you want to implement asynchronous programming, you have to specify this async keyword here. And once you specify the async, you have to give await here, and the return type will be task. This is very important interview question. So what is HATEOAS in Web API? So means hypermedia as the engine of application state is a constraint of REST that allows clients to navigate the API. To navigate the API dynamically, we'll use this. This response includes links to related resources that particular scenario will use. What is content negotiation? Content negotiation is the process of selecting response format. So web API by default, it can give the XML or JSON, what format you want. So this is called content negotiation. Very important because this is a process of selecting response format based on the client request. Based on your client request, what type of response you want, JSON response or you want XML response. This particular scenario we'll call it as a content negotiation. How you'll add services start, add controller, add XML serialization formatters. This is for to enable the XML support. You will specify this. So what is OData in ASP.NET Core Web API? OData is a standard protocol for querying and updating the data. It enables powerful query capabilities for filtering, sorting, pagination, all those things. OData is helpful. How you enable OData? You will add in program.cs services start, add OData. Like this, you will enable the OData. So what is Swagger and why it is used? Swagger, Postman, these two are the important things in that Swagger. So if you want to make the API documentation and if you want to test our API, this particular scenario will go for the Swagger. Postman is also one of the same thing. We can do the testing of API. So how you'll enable the Swagger? So first thing, builder.inprogram.cs, builder.services dot add Swagger gen. So in app.use Swagger, app.use Swagger UI. So this endpoint we have to specify. So if there is any error in the controller, for example, route is not correct or any duplicate route is there, so then it will give like error. So if everything clear, it will show a nice UI to test our API so easily using Swagger. How do you handle the state in the API? So APIs are stateless, as you know. So APIs are stateless by default, right? So but state can be managed using tokens, for example, JWT tokens or sessions. So how this will do? This will manage the state with JWT token in headers. We are going to keep the token in the header or session. So to carry the data for some particular time, okay? So till token expiration, that time it will carry the data. So what is web API routing? We have already seen routing to provide the navigation. Like as we have already discussed, two types of routes we have: convention-based routing by default and attribute routing. Like on top of the action, our controller, we are going to specify the route attribute. So this is config.route in program.cs. Like this default route will be there. If you want to change anything, you can change your controller name or whatever. So how the HTML response message? So this is if you want to get the HTML response from the HTTP response message. This particular scenario, response equals to new HTTP response message, and inside that you are going to write the string content, so which will be give the response in a HTML format.